Hey, Sip and Talkers. It's your host, Joe, and with me as always, Sunny.
We have a really significant stack of sources here today. Articles, research reports, news bits, and your notes. And they're all pointing towards, well, one of the most intense geopolitical flashpoints on the planet right now, the potential for conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And the lens these sources are using is really focused on this idea of war as a barbaric last step.
Yeah, that phrase definitely stands out.
So our mission in this deep dive is pretty clear, but it's complex. We need to peel back the layers on this material he sent over. You know, what are the key insights? What potential strategies are being discussed? How do the sources assess the risks and, well, the likelihood? And what actions are being taken, particularly by the U.S., according to this material? This is really about getting you, the listener, past the headlines and into the specific details and perspectives laid out right here. I'm definitely ready to dig into this. It's heavy, but critical stuff.
It is heavy, absolutely. And the sources, they don't really shy away from that weight. They use this phrase, the barbarism of war, the last step starting a war. And it seems they treat it as a very powerful, almost rhetorical condemnation.
Yeah.
War, in their view, is just fundamentally barbaric.
Barbaric. It feels like such an old word, but yeah, terrifyingly relevant today.
Yeah.
What makes the sources call it that specifically in this modern context?
Well, they lay out a few pretty stark reasons. I mean, at the most basic level, it's the sheer scale of violence and destruction. It just devastates infrastructure and tragically causes immense harm to civilians. That's a key point.
Right.
And the sources argue this stands in, direct opposition to modern values, things like peace, cooperation, human rights. They really see war as a regression, a step backward for civilization itself.
A step backward.
And specifically looking at the Taiwan Strait, the sources get very, very specific about the potential human cost. They cite concerns about tens of thousands of potential casualties on both sides of the strait. And economic collapse wouldn't just hit the island, it would likely affect both sides and create huge regional instability.
Okay, so massive human cost, economic fallout.
Exactly. And there's a particularly chilling point mentioned in the sources from a scholar, Yi Fuxian. He suggests a Taiwan Strait war could trigger something he calls a population avalanche. Basically, an irrecoverable collapse in birth rates on both sides, even if, governments tried aggressive pro-natal policies afterward.
A population avalanche.
Yeah.
Wow. That term alone is incredibly stark. It makes the human cost feel like this long-term demographic scar, not just the immediate loss of life.
Precisely. It goes way beyond the immediate battlefield casualties. And the sources also point out that initiating a conflict like this, well, it violates international law. It goes against the fundamental UN principles that call for peaceful dispute resolution. It's seen as just abandoning all other options. Just briefly, the sources do provide some historical context. They note the confrontation's been there since 1949, right? With the PRC claiming sovereignty and the ROC asserting its own. They kind of track how the PRC's concept of liberating Taiwan has shifted over time. It started as purely military language, apparently in a 1949 Jinhua news agency editorial, but later came to include potentially peaceful approaches too.
Okay, so the sources paint a very clear, very grim picture of why this potential conflict is viewed with such gravity, calling it barbaric because of the human, economic, and civilizational costs. With that incredibly high-stakes picture set, the sources then dive into the difficult question of how this barbaric last step might actually be taken. What are the potential strategies for military action that they outline?
Yeah, the material you provided discusses several possible paths, and these are based on news analysis, some research reports, and findings from war games.
Okay, lay them out for us. What's the first possibility the sources describe?
One potential approach is what's sometimes termed island chain warfare and blockade. The idea, and this is supported by perspectives like one from an ex-user at Micky频道mentioned in the sources, it involves potentially securing or neutralizing surrounding islands first, places like Kinmen and Matsu.
So controlling the periphery first, kind of choking it off.
Precisely. The purpose then would be to isolate the main island of Taiwan, gain control of the strait itself, cut off any external contact or resupply, and effectively blockade Taiwan to weaken its economy and military before attempting anything larger, potentially. And the sources connect this directly to recent reporting. There's a May 28, 2025 Central News Agency report cited. It mentions the USDIA's World Threat Assessment Report and suggests China might actually increase threats to these outer islands, Kinmen, Matsu, Dongsha, perhaps in 2025. Not necessarily as the start of a full invasion, the report suggests, but maybe as a way to pressure Taiwan and, test U.S. resolve.
Interesting. So maybe escalating in smaller steps first, sort of testing the waters. What's another potential military strategy the sources cover?
Another strategy discussed involves precision strikes on key infrastructure. This is mentioned citing sources like ex-users at Wangxin 3848 and Ascun 1989, who apparently reference reporting in the South China Morning Post, and naval and ordnance knowledge.
Precision strikes. Hitting vital civilian systems, then.
Exactly. The strategy described as hitting maybe 30 to 40 supercritical infrastructure nodes. We're talking power grids, water supplies, transportation hubs, internet backbones. The goal is to cause systemic collapse across the island. The aim here isn't primarily military targets, but to paralyze civilian life and undermine resistance.
Wow.
The sources actually frame this as an attempt to achieve victory without fighting, by making everyday life just untenable. There's even a chilling detail in the sources speculating on the best timing for such strikes. A weekday afternoon before a summer typhoon.
A weekday afternoon before a typhoon? That specific timing detail is quite revealing, isn't it? It's not just about the physical damage. It sounds very psychological, too.
Absolutely. Maximum disruption, maximum chaos.
So what about the large-scale scenario, the one most people probably picture when they think about this?
Right. That would be the amphibious landing and full invasion. The sources outline a potential phased PLA doctrine for this. First, establishing anti-access capabilities, trying to block or delay U.S. and Japanese intervention, then achieving sea and air control, followed by a blockade, and finally launching the massive landing forces needed. An ex-user at Joseph Wen is cited noting recent PLA deployment, things like landing forces and multiple rocket launcher units, which, could be seen as preparations for this kind of operation.
So they are reportedly building the capacity for it, then?
The sources indicate preparations are definitely observable. Yes. However, importantly, they also acknowledge the incredibly high difficulty of such an operation.
Right, it's not easy.
Not at all. It would require immense resources, massive coordination, and Taiwan's complex terrain and its existing strong defenses present really significant challenges to a successful landing.
Okay. Are there other, maybe less conventional ways the sources suggest conflict might manifest?
Yes, the sources do mention other means, which generally fall under the umbrella of hybrid warfare. This includes things like large-scale cyber attacks, widespread disinformation campaigns aimed at lowering morale and international support, and maybe economic sanctions. These are seen as ways to weaken Taiwan without necessarily firing a shot, so to speak.
Less kinetic.
Exactly. And military exercises are also discussed, like the Joint Sword series. These are viewed primarily as a deterrent, simulating blockade and landing scenarios. And ex-user at Joseph Wen's analysis, mentioned in the sources, suggests they can be staged as a direct response to political events, like the recent inauguration on May 20th, 2025.
Okay, so the sources really outline a kind of menu of potential actions, don't they? Ranging from targeted island pressure and infrastructure strikes to the monumental task of a full invasion, alongside these non-kinetic methods. And each one seems to have very different implications and challenges.
That's right. And assessing the feasibility and, the likelihood of these strategies leads directly into what the sources discuss regarding war games and expert assessments. They talk about potential outcomes and timing.
Right, the war games. What did the simulation suggest about the potential cost if things did escalate that far?
Well, the sources prominently feature findings from a pretty significant CSIS report. This was covered by the BBC back in January 2023. This particular war game simulated a potential 2026 scenario where the U.S. and Japan actively intervened to defend Taiwan.
Okay, and the outcome the simulation predicted, what did it look like?
The result was incredibly sobering, according to the sources. The PLA might be defeated within about 3 weeks, but Taiwan would suffer what the sources call a tragic victory.
A tragic victory? That doesn't sound good.
No, the cost would be catastrophic. We're talking severe devastation to Taiwan's economy and civilian life, heavy casualties for both U.S. and Japanese forces involved, and an estimated global economic loss reaching around $10 trillion.
$10 trillion. Wow. Tragic victory feels like an understatement when you hear that number.
It really does. And it starkly quantifies why the sources label this whole scenario barbaric. Even winning, if you can call it that, comes at an almost unimaginable price.
Yeah, truly staggering. What about the timing? Do the sources seem to agree on when this might be most likely, if it were to happen at all?
Well, the sources present a few different perspectives on timing. It's not uniform. There's a March 21, 2024 Radio Free Asia report mentioned, quoting U.S. Indo-Pacific Commander Aquilino. He apparently stated that China is developing its military capabilities at an unprecedented speed, aiming for readiness by 2027.
2027.
Yeah, and another source cited ex-user at Free Will in Wienma also points to 2027. They connect this readiness date to the PLA's 100th anniversary, suggesting it could be a politically significant target date, potentially influenced, the source suggests, by China's own internal economic and population challenges.
So 2027 appears as a potential milestone for readiness in at least some of these analyses.
It does seem to be a recurring date. But this contrasts with some near-term forecasts, like that May 28, 2025 DIA report we mentioned earlier. It predicts a full invasion is not likely in 2025. Although it does forecast that increased pressure and threats to the outer islands might occur this year.
Okay, so maybe readiness building towards 2027, but perhaps lower level pressure sooner. That makes sense. Are any alternative, maybe less costly strategies considered more probable than a full invasion by some of these sources?
Yes, definitely. A December 9, 2024 Commonwealth Magazine report cited in the material includes a think tank assessment. It suggests China is actually more likely to pursue its goals through isolation, using things like blockade and deterrence strategies, rather than attempting the super high-risk, very costly full invasion, which kind of aligns with those initial strategies we talked about, the island chain and blockade ideas.
Right, circling back.
And the sources also mentioned Taiwan's own efforts to deter all of this, like a May 23, 2025 report cited by ex-user at Chinese WSJ about Taiwan planning to equip its army and navy extensively with drones. The stated goal, according to the sources, is to make China wake up every day feeling unsuitable to invade Taiwan.
Quite a quote. Making that decision just too painful to contemplate, basically.
Exactly. It's about increasing the complexity and the potential cost of taking that barbaric last step.
This gives us a really detailed look based on the sources you provided at the potential actions, the projected devastating costs, and the varying timelines and likelihoods being discussed. Now, what do these sources tell us about how the United States is responding to this increasingly tense situation?
Well, the material details a pretty multi-pronged U.S. approach, starting with significant military deployment and preparation across the Indo-Pacific region.
What kind of preparation are we talking about here? What are the sources pointing to?
Well, since 2022, the sources note the U.S. has been investing nearly $800 million specifically to renovate and expand old WWII-era bases across the Pacific. Places like the Marianas Islands, Guam, Tinian, Palau, Micronesia.
Reviving old bases?
Yeah. The stated goal, according to the sources, is to leverage this existing historical infrastructure for modern operations, to increase flexibility and resilience in what they describe as a contested operational environment. Spreading out assets, basically.
And weapons.
They're also deploying new offensive weapon systems. The sources specifically highlight the U.S. Army deploying the Typhoon missile system. This was apparently done in the northern Philippines during joint exercises.
Typhoon. What exactly is that system, and why is its deployment there significant, according to these sources?
The sources describe Typhoon as a land-based system using the Mark 41 vertical launch system, the same kind used on Navy ships, and they point out its range capabilities. It can launch Tomahawk cruise missiles over 1,000 miles and SM-6 missiles over 200 miles. The significance, as interpreted by the sources, is that deployed from the northern Philippines, these missiles can potentially reach targets along the Chinese coast. They could threaten shipping lanes in the strait and potentially even hit Chinese military bases in southern areas like Guangzhou and Hainan Island.
Wow. So putting long-range precision strike capability right on the doorstep, essentially. What's the source's interpretation of these specific U.S. military moves, the base upgrades, and this missile deployment? How do they read it?
The source is quite direct in its interpretation here. It explicitly states that these actions renovating these historical bases and deploying offensive missile systems like Typhoon indicate that the U.S. sees war with China as, quote, real and imminent.
Real and imminent. That's strong language.
Very. And it goes further, stating that the U.S. sees its target as very clear. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP. That's the source's interpretation.
That's a really specific and, frankly, quite pointed conclusion drawn by the source. Beyond this military buildup, what does the material say about diplomatic efforts? Is that happening too?
Yes, the sources mention the U.S. Secretary of Defense's address at the Shangri-La Security Forum. According to the source, the SecDef stated there that any forceful invasion of Taiwan would unleash devastating consequences across the entire Indo-Pacific region and indeed the rest of the world.
Okay, highlighting the global impact, trying to raise the stakes diplomatically, what's the stated primary goal of the overall U.S. strategy, according to these sources?
The source states the U.S. goal is fundamentally about deterring war. trying to prevent it from happening in the first place, by ensuring the potential cost of aggression is perceived as just too high.
Making it unthinkable.
Right. And this is meant to be achieved through building a strong deterrent shield, working closely with allies. The ultimate aim, the Course says, is maintaining peace and stability. This courses also note the U.S. is actively urging Asian countries, much like it has urged European partners regarding Russia, to shoulder more responsibility, to increase their own defense spending, and collectively push back against what the sources describe as China's hegemonic ambitions, rather than leaving the burden solely on the U.S.
A call for a greater collective security effort among allies in the region. Makes sense. And what about direct U.S. support for Taiwan's own defenses? Anything specific there?
Yes, there's a significant point drawn from a Reuters exclusive cited in the sources. It reports on plans within the U.S. government for what's described as unprecedented arms sales to Taiwan. Particularly, it notes, under a potential second Trump administration, the aim is reportedly to accelerate the delivery of advanced weaponry.
Wow, unprecedented arms sales. What's the source's takeaway from that specific report? How do they interpret that possibility?
Well, the source interprets this potential move as something that could alleviate concerns among some observers that a Trump presidency might, distance itself from Taiwan or abandon it. It reinforces, from the source's perspective, that the Indo-Pacific remains the core future focus of U.S. strategy, and that the loss of Taiwan is seen as directly threatening both U.S. homeland interests and the interests of its key allies in the region.
Okay, so strengthening deterrence through direct arms support as well.
Right. Now, shifting slightly, the sources you provided also delve into some related U.S. domestic actions and concerns. These aren't purely military or diplomatic, maybe, but they're presented as relevant to the overall picture of how the U.S. is responding.
Domestic actions, like what kind of things are highlighted?
The sources mention the U.S. engaging in strict review and potential entry restrictions for individuals. They state the U.S. is actively involved in expelling or denying entry to people based on having made what are deemed anti-U.S. remarks.
Expelling people for remarks. That sounds surprising given U.S. principles of free speech.
That's certainly how the sources frame it. They cite the State Department as being resolute in using all available tools to verify identities and determine eligibility for entry. The sources really emphasize the U.S. government's position here, that a visa is considered a privilege, not an inherent right, and that every single visa decision is viewed as a national security decision.
Every single one. Okay.
And the sources note that all travelers entering the U.S. are subject to ongoing interagency security review. Any past issues, including arrests apparently, can show up in these reviews and affect visa or entry decisions. They specifically point to increased scrutiny for all Chinese citizens, including those holding Hong Kong passports, particularly if they have perceived links to the CCP or are studying in fields deemed sensitive.
Sensitive fields, okay.
And the State Department is said to maintain denial lists that include CCP members and supporters, with national security cited as a sufficient ground for denial, either during the visa application process or right there upon arrival at Customs and Border Protection, CBP.
So according to the sources, it's not just about potential direct security threats. It seems to extend to perceived political alignment or past statements.
That appears to be the implication the source is drawing, yes. They suggest this policy could impact certain public figures in Taiwan who have been perhaps vocal in supporting the CCP or criticizing U.S. policy or praising mainland China. The source even goes so far as to advise such individuals mentioned to perhaps reconsider their plans for travel to the U.S.
That's a remarkably direct piece of analysis or advice coming from the source material itself. Wow. What else is discussed regarding entry and scrutiny? Anything else on that front?
Yes, the sources also discuss the powers of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, to search electronic devices at the border, your phone, your laptop. They state that CBP asserts the right to search any traveler's device, even those belonging to U.S. citizens. And the legal premise cited is that individuals at the border point are not yet formally inside the U.S., and therefore constitutional protections regarding searches don't fully apply in the same way there.
Wait, hang on. They can just demand to search your phone when you arrive, even if you're a citizen.
According to the sources, yes, that's the power they claim. They distinguish between two types of searches mentioned. A basic search is described as manually looking through information on the device contacts, call logs, social media, photos, which naturally requires the phone to be unlocked. Then there's an advanced search. This involves copying files, attempting to recover deleted data using forensic tools. The sources state this advanced search requires reasonable suspicion of a violation and supervisor approval, but the basic search sounds less constrained.
And how long does this take?
These checks, they note, can take hours, and devices can potentially be held for longer. The sources provide examples of travelers being denied entry specifically because of content found on their phones. They cite instances related to alleged hate speech or maybe photos or comments expressing support for groups like Hamas. They even point out that U.S. permanent residents, green card holders, are mentioned as facing potential risk of expulsion or revocation of their green card if their speech is seen as conflicting with official U.S. policy.
That power feels quite sweeping. Very concerning for privacy.
The sources acknowledge that. They mention concerns within the U.S. itself regarding potential CBP abuse of these powers. And given these potential search risks, the source offers a pretty practical, if maybe extreme, suggestion for travelers heading to the U.S. Consider using a backup phone with no sensitive personal information, or performing a factory reset on your primary device before traveling, or just removing social media and messaging apps beforehand.
That's pretty intense advice, really driven by the source's assessment of the risk there. What concerns do the sources raise about internal dynamics within Taiwan itself? Anything on that?
Yes, the sources express some notable concerns about Taiwan's internal politics and what they perceive as potential CCP infiltration or influence. They state the U.S. is reportedly applying pressure on Taiwan's main opposition parties, the KMT and the TPP, specifically urging them not to obstruct President Lai Ching-te's government's efforts to increase the defense budget to 3% of GDP.
Pressure on opposition parties over the defense budget. Why does the source view opposition to that budget increase as so significant?
The source takes a very, very strong stance here. They argue that opposition obstruction to increasing the defense budget directly hinders U.S. interests and national security goals regarding Taiwan. And in their framing, this potentially makes those obstructing parties, quote, enemies of the United States.
Wow. Framing internal political opposition within Taiwan as potentially being an enemy of the U.S. based on this single budget issue. That's quite a statement from the source. What specific examples do the sources give regarding this alleged infiltration or influence?
Well, they mention one incident, the alleged censorship of the word Taiwan in a song during a public event in Taipei. The source interprets this specific incident as an example of the KMT-controlled city government possibly fearing causing offense to the CCP. They also mention reports of KMT members being arrested for organizing trips to China for what are described as United Front activities.
United Front activities.
Yeah, the sources describe these activities as promoting concepts like one family across the strait and actively supporting specific candidates back in Taiwan, which is framed as potentially violating Taiwan's own anti-infiltration laws. On social media, the sources highlight what they describe as widespread fake accounts, often using attractive profile pictures. These accounts apparently consistently post what's seen as typical CCP propaganda phrases like, "I am willing to be unified by China."
Okay, so influence operations at multiple levels. That's what the sources are suggesting.
That's the picture they paint, yeah. And the source expresses concern that some segments of Taiwan's youth, particularly those identified in the source as TPP supporters, may lack a sufficient sense of crisis regarding the situation with China, and potentially hold what the source terms illusions about the PRC's intentions.
A lack of urgency, perhaps.
That seems to be the concern. And the sources also offer a perspective on Taiwan's current political status itself. They argue that the island's very existence, in its current form, is itself a product of historical power dynamics and international involvement, specifically mentioning the protective deployment of the U.S. 7th Fleet in the past as a key factor.
Right.
So the source finds the argument, sometimes made by opposition figures in Taiwan, that the U.S. is interfering in Taiwan's internal affairs to be, quote, very laughable, and criticizes them for potentially not understanding, as the source puts it, who is friend, who is enemy.
That's a really pointed critique directly from the source material about the internal political debate in Taiwan. It sounds like all these different threads, military readiness, border security, internal politics, information flow, are seen by the sources as deeply interconnected challenges.
Absolutely, and this leads to a final related point the sources explore. The really challenging balance the U.S. faces. The balance between upholding its own principles, like free speech rights, and countering what they see as malicious influence and actions from the CCP.
That does sound like a tightrope walk. How do the sources describe that challenge?
The sources frame this as a difficult-to-win war. That's the phrase used. On one hand, you have the U.S. founded on principles of free expression, but on the other, they are trying to combat sophisticated foreign influence operations.
Yeah, a real dilemma.
And the sources explicitly link those CBP device search powers we discussed right back to national security justifications. Even while acknowledging that this power seems to stand in tension with American ideals of free speech and privacy, It's a contradiction, they point out. One source even presents a more extreme viewpoint, suggesting that the First Amendment itself, the bedrock of free speech, is potentially becoming democracy's greatest weakness because it could be exploited by foreign powers aiming to destabilize elected governments from within.
So in this tense geopolitical environment, even foundational democratic principles are, in the view of some of these sources, becoming vulnerabilities that can be leveraged by external actors.
That's a heavy concept to grapple with. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground in this deep dive, drawing directly from this really dense stack of sources you provided. Let's just quickly try and pull together some of the core threads we've explored here. Okay, well, we started by understanding why these sources portray war, especially in the Taiwan Strait context, as a truly barbaric last step, highlighting the horrific potential for mass casualties, that idea of a demographic population avalanche, economic devastation on a global scale, and just a fundamental violation of modern values and international law.
Right. Then we unpacked the potential military strategies discussed in the sources, from seizing surrounding islands and imposing blockades, to launching precision strikes aimed at crippling infrastructure, and the monumental, though admittedly very challenging, prospect of a full amphibious invasion, alongside those hybrid tactics like cyber warfare and disinformation.
Yeah, and we saw what the findings from simulations like the CSIS war game suggest, that even successfully repelling an invasion, especially with U.S. and Japanese intervention, was likely come at an almost unbearable cost for everyone involved, leading to that phrase, tragic victory, with trillions in global economic losses and immense damage to Taiwan.
And we looked at the differing perspectives on likelihood and timing presented in the sources, some analysts pointing towards 2027 readiness, while others suggest a full invasion is maybe unlikely in 2025, though increased threats to outer islands might be probable sooner. We also noted the view that strategies focused on isolation via blockade might be considered more probable by some sources than that full-scale invasion.
Exactly. And finally, we detailed the multifaceted U.S. response as outlined in the sources, a significant military buildup and deployment across the Indo-Pacific, including those base renovations and the deployment of new missile systems like Typhoon. Diplomatic efforts focused on deterrence and rallying allies, the potential for those unprecedented arms sales to Taiwan. And even these domestic measures like strict entry restrictions based on perceived affiliations or remarks, extensive electronic device searches at the border, and the source's concerns about internal political influence and alleged infiltration within Taiwan itself.
Yeah, it's abundantly clear from all this material that the sources consistently underscore the devastating, potentially civilization-altering impact any potential conflict would have on human lives, on economies, and just the fabric of society.
Definitely. And the sources ultimately seem to circle back to the idea that diplomacy and dialogue, well, they remain the most desirable path to avoid this barbaric outcome. While at the same time, Taiwan's efforts to strengthen its own defenses, like its focus on drones, are seen as crucial for raising the perceived cost and complexity for any potential aggressor.
Making that calculation much harder.
Precisely. Yet what's truly striking in reviewing all the source material together is how it presents potential conflict as being so much more than just military calculations and hardware. It's not just tanks and missiles. It's deeply interwoven with economic vulnerabilities, the profound demographic impact on populations, the complex flow and manipulation of information and ideas, and even these fundamental questions about free speech, sovereignty, and who gets to define interference. So considering the potential costs we've seen discussed here and all the layered factors involved, it really raises an important question, I think, for all of us. In a world where influence, deterrence, and the potential for that barbaric last step seem increasingly intertwined and blurry, how do nations and how do we as individuals navigate such a complex and, frankly, fraught landscape?
That is a powerful and perhaps, unsettling thought to leave with. This deep dive, driven entirely by the sources you shared with us, has given us a really comprehensive, if challenging, overview of the perspectives and potential realities surrounding the Taiwan Strait situation as presented in this material. So thank you for bringing this material to us and allowing us to explore it in depth like this. We definitely encourage you, the listener, to continue reflecting on these critical points and exploring this very complex topic further. And we'll be ready for the next stack of sources whenever you are.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.